Welcome to Notorious Minds, where we examine those that have altered destiny and changed human history. I am M.R. Parks. If you have not done so already, please consider subscribing to this channel. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Warning: the following video contains violent content, graphic images, and descriptions which may be considered disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
Over 50 years ago, in the fall of 1971, in the prosperous town of Westfield, New Jersey, a father committed the unthinkable. Before there was ever Scott Peterson or Chris Watts, there was John Liss, the family Annihilator. This is his story. John Emil Liss was born on September 17, 1925 in Bay City, Michigan. He was the only child of German-American parents John Frederick Liss and Alma Barbara Florence Liss. John grew up in a very strict household as an only child. Mr. and Mrs. Liss were very involved in their church, attending services regularly. Mr. Liss was a very stoic man, and his son John had his father's same personality. As an adult, like his father, John was a devout Lutheran and a Sunday school teacher. He was a deeply religious man, an introvert. He graduated from Bay City Central High School in 1943. That same year, he enlisted in the United States Army and served as a laboratory technician during World War II. His father died in 1944. After John was discharged from the Army in 1946, he enrolled in the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. There he earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in accounting, and was commissioned a lieutenant through ROTC. During November of 1950, as the Korean War escalated, Liss was recalled to active military service at Fort Eustis in Virginia. He met Helen Morse Taylor, the widow of an infantry officer killed in action in Korea. Eventually, she and her daughter moved in with Liss. John and Helen married in December 1st of 1951 in Baltimore, Maryland, and the family moved to Northern California. The Army, recognizing Liss' accounting skills, reassigned him to the Finance Corps. After completion of his second tour of duty in 1952, Liss worked for an accounting firm in Detroit, then as an audit supervisor at a paper company in Kalamazoo, where his 3 children were born. Their first child was Patricia. She was born on January 8th of 1955. Then their son John was born in 1956. And Frederick Liss, their youngest, was born on August 26 of 1958. By 1959, John had risen to general supervisor of the company's accounting department. Unfortunately, Helen, his wife, had become an alcoholic by then. By this time, Helen had become increasingly unstable due to syphilis. She had contracted from her first husband, which she did not disclose to John before their marriage. In 1960, his stepdaughter Brenda married and left the household, and Liss moved with the remainder of his family to Rochester, New York, to take a job at the Xerox company. In 1968, John Liss accepted a position as vice president and controller at a bank in New Jersey, in Jersey City, and moved with his wife, his children, into Breeze Knolls Mansion, a 19-room Victorian mansion located at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey. By the 1970s, John and Helen had been married for nearly 20 years. John Liss' elderly mother also lived with the family in an attic apartment on the 3rd floor. From the outside, they look like the picture-perfect family, but looks can be deceiving. On November 9th of 1971, Liss murdered his entire immediate family using a 9mm semi-automatic handgun and his father's Colt .22 revolver. John Liss woke up and had breakfast with his children, trying not to look as if there was anything wrong. Once his kids left for school, he walked into the den. He grabbed the two firearms. While his children were at school, he shot his wife, Helen, age 47, in the back of the head. Then his mother, Alma, 84, above the left eye. After John murdered his dear mother, he went back downstairs and he dragged his wife's body to the ballroom on the other side of the house. Then John went back to the kitchen and cleaned up the blood from his wife's body. And then John sat down and he had lunch. Yes, he ate after he had just murdered his wife and his mother. As his daughter Patricia, 16, and younger son Frederick, 13, arrived home from school, List shot each one of them in the head. John List then dragged the bodies of his son and daughter into the ballroom as well and laid them next to their mother. List drove to his bank to close his and his mother's bank accounts, then to Westfield High School to watch his oldest son, John Frederick, 15, play a soccer game. After driving his son home, young John walked into the kitchen and placed his gym bag on the counter. John List Sr. then shot his son John repeatedly because the gun must have misfired on the first shot. Little John was not dead. Realizing what his father was trying to do, the young teenager fought for his life, but he was unsuccessful. John List shot his son 10 times to make sure he was dead. John List placed the bodies of his wife and his children on sleeping bags in the mansion ballroom. In a 5-page letter to his pastor found on the desk in his study later, John List claimed that he saw too much evil in the world and he had to kill his family to save their souls. He then cleaned the house and removed his pictures from all the family photographs in the house and turned the radio on and departed. Usually there is a 48-hour window authorities have to capture a predator before apprehension starts to go cold. But John List planned the annihilation of his family so well that for over a month the murders were not discovered. Yes, a month. The murders were not discovered until December 7th of 1971, nearly a month later, partly because of the family's reclusive tendencies. John List was so meticulous about covering up his crimes that he sent notes to his children's schools and part-time job claiming that the children would be visiting their ailing maternal grandmother, his mother-in-law, in North Carolina for a few weeks. Coincidentally, his mother-in-law became sick and had to cancel a visit to Westfield because of it. She was going to visit her daughter in Westfield. Had she made the trip, John List later said, she would have been his 6th victim. John also stopped milk and mail deliveries and the newspaper. He turned all the lights on in the house to make it appear that someone was home. And it was finally the neighbors who alerted authorities that something was suspicious. Neighbors noticed that all the mansion rooms were lit day and night without no apparent activity within the house. After light bulbs began burning out one by one, they called the police. On December 7, officers came to the house. Neighbors were concerned something might be wrong, so the officers entered the house through an open window and made their way through the house. There was a light coming from the 2nd floor, which slightly lit the 1st floor. They passed through the kitchen and saw what appeared to be bloodstains on the floor. They could smell the unmistakable, pungent odor of death. They could hear music playing throughout the house. The officers then walked toward the ballroom. The room was dark and there were curtains at the entrance. When the officers shined their flashlight into the room, they discovered a grisly sight. They discovered 4 bodies laying in the ballroom on the floor. The police shouted, "Westfield police!" expecting the perceived individuals on the floor to wake up, but they never moved. The officers then walked closer as they noticed their faces were covered. They uncovered the face of one of the victims, who had a cloth over it, only to discover they were dead. Their bodies were lying on sleeping bags. 3 children and their mother all had been shot. One boy had multiple bullet wounds. Officers immediately went to call for backup. John List and his elderly mother were still unaccounted for. The officers continued to search the house until backup arrived. Remember, there are still 19 rooms in the mansion. Each time they went into a different room, they didn't know what they were going to find. As they opened each closed door, there was a sense that somebody was going to jump out at them. After nearly 45 minutes of searching, the officers made it to the 3rd floor apartment. There in a back room, they found the body of John's 85-year-old mother. She too had a gunshot wound to the head. The position that she was on the floor was like she had fallen to her knees and then over backwards. It was like she was trying to get away from somebody. She was her own son. The only member of the household not accounted for was John List. Police didn't have to wonder why for long. There was a letter in John's office that the police found, and 2 guns, and the letter was addressed to John's pastor. It was dated on November 9th of 1971, 4 weeks earlier. John said in it, in a detached, meticulous tone, John List took full responsibility for the murder of his family. He wrote that he was facing bankruptcy and that he had killed his family to spare them from what he believed was the sinful effects of poverty. I know what I've done is wrong. I'm sure many will say, how can anyone do such a horrible thing? He wrote, all have gone to heaven now. He ended the letter with a chilling detail. P.S. Mother is in the hallway in the attic 3rd floor. She was too heavy to move. That letter launched a nationwide manhunt. 2 days after finding the bodies, the family car, a green 1968 Chevrolet Impala sedan, was found parked at JFK John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, but police found no evidence that John List had boarded a plane. The date on the parking voucher from the airport was dated on November 10th. Wherever John List went after that, he had a month's head start. The authorities issued a nationwide warrant for the man John Emil List. Police noticed a trail of blood that indicated that Helen and the children had been shot in the kitchen and dragged to the ballroom. Police also found bags of blood-soaked paper towels and a bloody mop, further evidence that John cleaned up the murder scene. John had recently lost his banking job. He was having great financial difficulties and feared his family would have to go on welfare. As a devout Lutheran, John List feared that his family was turning away from God. Because of that, he feared that his family would stop going to church, that he had no other recourse than to take their lives to spare them from hell. He disapproved of his daughter wanting to be an actress, a profession that he considered to be immoral. John believed that if he murdered his family, that they would go to heaven, and that he could ask for forgiveness later and meet them one day in heaven. John List looked his own mother straight in the face and pulled the trigger. Also, his oldest son, John Frederick, took longer to die because he fought for his life. His oldest son had several bullets in him. John shot him until he was satisfied that his son was dead. Before John left his family in that ballroom, he stood over them and said a prayer. He said later that was the least he could do. Neighbors eventually told authorities that John was a weird man who had very few friends. All reliable photographs of John List in that house were destroyed. Evidence showed that the 2 guns the police found in John's desk were the murder weapons. Autopsies revealed that all of John's victims had been shot in the head. At first, police believed that John may have committed suicide when they were unable to locate him, and occasionally there were sightings of John List in the Midwest, but nothing ever came of those sightings. For years, authorities would post John's story on the anniversary of the mass murder in the media without any success, but the meticulous accountant seemingly committed the perfect crime. On January 27, 1981, 6-year-old Adam Walsh was kidnapped from inside a Sears department store at Hollywood Mall in Florida. Adam was abducted by a drifter named Otis Toole near the front exterior of the Sears, after Toole had been instructed by a security guard to leave the mall. After his arrest, Otis Toole would say that he had lured Adam into his white 1971 Cadillac DeVille with promises of toys and candy, then proceeded to drive north on Interstate 95 toward his home in Jacksonville. According to Toole, Adam at first was docile and compliant, but then he started to panic when Toole drove on for a while. Toole punched him in the face, but as this just made the situation worse, he then beat him unconscious. 6 years old, he beat him unconscious. While Adam was unconscious, Toole drove north on the Florida Turnpike to a deserted service road just north of Radabow Road overpass in northwest St. Lucie County. When Toole realized that Adam was still breathing, he strangled him with his seatbelt, dragged him out of the car, and decapitated the small boy with a machete. Toole also claimed to have incinerated Adam's body in an old refrigerator. When he returned to Jacksonville, he claimed that he wanted to make Adam his adoptive son, but that was not feasible. Adam's remains were found 2 weeks later. In the wake of their child's senseless death, John and Reeve Walsh realized there were so many other children and families who needed help. Along with other child advocates, they founded the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. As a result of his son's death, John Walsh became the host and launched a series on Fox. In 1988, it was called America's Most Wanted. Since its inception, America's Most Wanted had led to the capture of over 1,100 criminals. So authorities went to America's Most Wanted and asked them to do a segment on the story of John List. If anyone could capture John List, America's Most Wanted could. The story of John List was broadcast into American homes on May 21st, 1989.
Tonight on America's Most Wanted. Now tonight's first case. The oldest we've ever pursued on America's Most Wanted.
John List had evaded police capture for 17 years, 6 months, and 23 days. John Walsh was determined to bring John List to justice. But there was a problem. At the end of each episode, viewers see a photograph of the criminal. John List's appearance most likely had changed since 1971. What would he look like almost 20 years later? The John List murder case would now enter a highly specialized world of forensic sculpting. Forensic sculptor Frank Bender took on the task of reconstructing John List's face to age him 20 years. Frank Bender utilized physical anthropologists, forensic dentists, pathologists, detectives in order to sculpt John List's aged face. Using measurements on a skull as guidelines, he can reconstruct a face with clay. Frank Bender sculpted the aging face of the mass murderer John List. He added 18 years to his face. He even chose the glasses that John List would probably be wearing. Frank even spoke to a psychologist to find out what kind of person John List would be. Frank sculpted his mouth angled downward in the corners of John List's mouth as proceed from anxiety for the mass murder of his family. Based on the psychologist's assessment, John List did not kill out of his devotion to God, but he murdered his entire family out of his anger and resentment and pride. He didn't want the world to see his family on welfare. John List had a surgical scar behind his right ear, and Frank researched how it would look after being aged for 18 years. Frank looked through dozens of pairs of glasses until he found the one he thought that John List would wear after 20 years. The night America's Most Wanted revealed the forensic bust of John List, Wanda Flannery and her daughter were watching from their home in Denver, Colorado. And unbeknownst to everybody else, John List was watching as well. Much to Wanda Flannery's horror, they saw a striking resemblance between their old neighbor, Robert, and John List. As they watched the show, it just all started to add up that he was an accountant, a Lutheran, and that he had a scar behind his right ear. By the time America Most Wanted revealed the sculpture, Wanda knew it was him. The glasses and the jowls, Wanda said, "Oh my God, Robert is John List." Wanda called the FBI. She told them that her former neighbor, Bob Clark, aka John List, recently moved to Richmond, Virginia, and was using the name Bob Clark. The FBI went to John's house in Virginia and spoke to his wife, and she answered the door. His wife said, "There is no way my husband can be John List. He's at work right now. You can go to his job yourself." The FBI went to the accounting office where he worked in Richmond. Agents walked into Bob's office and asked him, "Are you Bob Clark?" And the man said, "Yes, I'm Bob Clark." Then the agent says, "Are you John List?" John said, "No, I'm Robert Clark." But then they noticed the scar behind his right ear. And a fingerprint check matched prints on a gun permit application John List had filled out 1 month before the murders. Bob Clark and John List were the same man. Amazingly, the same style of glasses that Frank Bender had used on the forensic bust. Frank Bender was 100% right. The picture of John List when he was captured was put next to the picture of the bust on the front page of the New York Times. John List had the same exact glasses on that Frank Bender had put on the forensic bust. It was uncanny. The story unfolded of how a mild-mannered church-going accountant meticulously planned the brutal execution of his entire family. This is how it happened. John was introverted, soft-spoken gentleman, and for 6 years the family had lived in Westfield. But the week of November 9th, 1971, letters arrived at the schools of the List children. Patricia, who was 16, little John, who was 15, and his younger brother Frederick, who was 13. Their father had written that the family would be going out of town for a few weeks to help care for their ailing maternal grandmother. For the next few weeks, the List mansion sat quietly lit up by the inside lights. The inside lights never went out. But slowly, eventually, the lights started going out one by one. This caught the attention of the neighbors, who called the Westfield police. On December 7th of 1971, officers Charles Heller and George Zelznick arrived at the List house. The neighbors told the police the Lists were on a trip, but they did not know if their elderly mother went with them because the police is concerned for the old woman, so they decided to enter the List house. The police found an unlocked window. The lights were on the second floor, which sort of barely lit up the first floor. They passed through the butler's pantry and to the kitchen. They noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on the floor, and the unnerving part of the whole situation was there was music playing throughout the house. It was a very solemn, almost like a funeral home. The officers then made their way towards the ballroom on the opposite side of the house. There were drapes covering the room, and the officers shined their flashlights into the room where there was a light. They discovered a rather grisly sight. We could see there were several bodies on sleeping bags, and their faces were covered. They called out several times that this is the Westfield police. Would you mind getting up? But nobody responded. They were the bodies of Helen List and her 3 children, Patricia, Frederick, and John. All had been shot in the head. The middle child, John, showed evidence of multiple bullet wounds. Officer Zelnick immediately went to call for backup. Unaccounted for was John List and his elderly mother. Officers split up to search from room to room as they waited for backup to arrive. It was a big house, literally 3 floors, 19 rooms. Every time the officers went into a different room, they didn't know what they were going to find. They did consider that the perpetrator of this crime might still be in the house. Backup soon arrived. After nearly 45 minutes of searching, they found the body of John List's 85-year-old mother, Alma. She too had a gunshot wound to her head. In the position she was on the floor, it was like she fell to her knees and then she fell over backwards, as if she was trying to get away from somebody. The only member of the household not accounted for was John himself, but police didn't have to wonder why for long. In his first floor office, they found a 5-page letter written by John and addressed to his pastor. John List took full responsibility for the murder of his family. At least I'm certain that all have gone to heaven. He ended the letter with a horrible detail. P.S. My mother is on the 3rd floor. She was too heavy to move. With a family annihilator on the loose, police launched a nationwide manhunt. 2 days after finding the bodies, police located John List's Chevy Impala at Kennedy International Airport, but the fugitive List had nearly a month head start. For 2 more decades, the letter he left at the crime scene would be the last that they heard of him. Years later, John List would give an interview at age 77, detailing his crimes. This is what he said. He sat down with reporters to explain why he did the unthinkable. It seemed his life was marked with a series of minor disappointments that eventually became too much for him to bear. John Emil List, the son of strict German-American parents, was the only child. There was no brothers or sisters to either play with or fight with. Besides his parents, he was totally alone. Not even one friend. His father, Frederick, was a stern, hard-working man who valued self-sufficiency. His mother, Alma, obsessively doted on her son. John believed the marriage to Helen was the first of several disappointments, but John was forced to marry her because he thought she was pregnant. It turned out she was not pregnant, and then years later, he was resentful toward her because of it. But because he hated confrontation, he tried to make the marriage work. He was passive-aggressive. The couple soon started a family. Patricia, John, and Frederick were born. John List was, by most accounts, an attentive father. He was not a social, playful father towards his kids, like playing out in the backyard, playing ball out in the backyard, but he was, in his own way, a good dad. He said, he certainly loved them all, but beneath the seemingly pleasant exterior lurked an individual completely unable to express his feelings. John List always kept his emotions to himself from the time he was a small boy. He began a series of accounting jobs that brought him little success. Over the next 7 years, as List struggled to advance his career, the family often moved to accommodate his frequent job changes. He was fired each time, not because of work performance, but because there was something about his personality. He was odd. In 1965, John was hired at the First National Bank of New Jersey as a vice president. His career, it seemed, was finally on an upward track. The List immediately bought one of the grandest old houses in the affluent town of Westfield, New Jersey, a mansion. He did not want the big house. He felt that he was being pressured to do so by his wife. Because of the demands of a growing family, he made the decision to borrow the money from his mother, and then he invited his mother to come and live with him. The pressures were building. His wife drank alcohol too much and was often at odds with her husband. The marital problems only increased with the presence of List's overbearing mother. By 1966, List was failing to fit in at his job. Once again, John List was fired from the bank after only 1 year. From that point, everything was going downhill. That's when he started realizing he was not a success. He was failing to provide for his family. The problems kept mounting, and his pride wouldn't allow him to tell his family that he got fired. He would get dressed up in a suit every day and drive his car to the train station and take the train several stops, so people thought John List was still employed. List encouraged his children to seek part-time work. He told them it would teach them maturity and responsibility, but really it was to keep the family financially solvent. He was overwhelmed by his problems and came to view his family as a burden. He was extremely resentful of his mother and wife, especially his wife, because she had tricked him into marrying her. By November of 1971, he was facing bankruptcy. The proud, deeply religious John List now began contemplating his options. First was the idea of suicide, which he considered a mortal sin. He felt that if he committed suicide, he would automatically go to hell. There was the possibility of simply fleeing the scene and leaving the family at the mercy of the welfare system. They were going to be destitute, and John's understanding of religion, that poverty was a sin. Because of pride, John simply ruled that out. He felt that his family would lose their eternal soul and be damned. Based on all John's decisions, all John's options, was based on his selfishness. Seeing no other choice, John finally made the decision to kill his family. As he explained it in his shocking 5-page letter to his pastor, he kept thinking about it for several weeks. He considered it for a month, and his final solution was that he would do it. According to John, he was sending them to heaven. John reasoned that he could still get forgiveness from God later. John List admitted later his solution was horrific. His psychiatrist attributed it to his obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. This simply means that he's the kind of individual as being the type of person that he gets into a rut rethinking the problem and never coming up with any new ideas, but coming back to the same old solution: to kill them. John List thought long and hard about how he would kill his family. The morning after getting dressed to have breakfast with his 3 children, Patricia, John, and Frederick, he tried not to act any differently than he ordinarily would so they wouldn't be suspicious. Like he did every other school day, John List watched them eat their meal and then rush off to school. After they were gone, he went out to the garage and got the guns ready. John's wife, Helen, meanwhile had come down to the kitchen for her morning coffee. He spoke with his wife for a few minutes, left the kitchen, and then circled back around to the front room, then came around back and shot her in the back of the head. John then went to his mother's 3rd-floor apartment where she was beginning to have breakfast. She stood up to greet her beloved son and kissed him on the cheek. She said, "What was that noise?" At that point, he felt like a Judas. "I don't know. It must be something from outside. That's why I came upstairs." She started to walk away, and that's when he killed the woman that gave him life. He then headed downstairs to clean up the evidence of his wife's murder before the children returned home. He was very surprised at the amount of blood that drained out of his wife's body. He saw shell casings on the floor and her false teeth that had blown out of her mouth and were laying on the floor. So he cleaned up all that. He moved Helen's lifeless body into the seldom used ballroom. John made himself a sandwich and waited for his children to return from school. Even with his wife and his mother dead in the house, List says he had no second thoughts. He didn't have any feelings of, no, I can't do this. His 16-year-old daughter, Patty, was the first to arrive home. As she walked into the kitchen, her father snuck up behind her and shot her in the back of the head. He removed her corpse into the ballroom and placed her on a sleeping bag near her mother. He thought it better than just leaving her on the bare floor. Then his youngest son, 13, Frederick, entered the house. Liz shot him in the back of the head as well and placed him on a sleeping bag next to his sister. Then instead of waiting for his last son, John, to come home, he decided to pick him up at school. He had a soccer game, so we went over and watched the soccer game. When they got home, father and son walked in through the kitchen door, and the 15-year-old placed his gym bag on the counter. His father then came up behind him and shot him in the head, but the gun seemed to misfire. This final murder would not be as quick as the others. All the others just dropped to the floor and were dead. The sound of the gun caused his son to jerk around a bit, but then I shot him several more times. It was later determined that Liz shot his son 10 times. After moving John's body to the ballroom with the rest of the family, Liz's mission was last complete. After he had shot John and cleaned up, he felt such a measure of relief that this plot had been completed without being interrupted. Unbelievably, after John List shot his entire family, he sat down and ate dinner. And List said, like when he was in combat, we were out killing and fighting, and then we would come in and have something to eat. He straightened up the kitchen, then went upstairs to bed. He actually went to sleep. Truth is crazier than fiction. He said, I may not have slept 100%, but I think I got a peaceful night's sleep. Well, isn't that nice for him? The next morning, John prepared his getaway. First, he turned the thermostat down to 50 degrees, hoping to keep the bodies from decomposing. He then turned on all the lights in the house and turned the radio to his favorite classical music station. John List's final act was to write a letter to his pastor explaining his reason for murdering his family. I guess I just felt closest to him and felt that since I was a member of his congregation, that he deserved to know the truth. Nearly a month before police discovered the letter and the bodies of his family, John List was about 2,000 miles away. John List had traveled by train from New Jersey, first to Michigan, then to Colorado. He settled in Denver in early 1972. I just thought I would like to see the mountains and relax a little bit because I had been under a lot of strain. Poor him. He last went to Denver, moved into a hotel room. He then applied for the Social Security number of Robert Peter Clark. Back then it was easier to take somebody's identity, not like it is today. One of his college classmates' name was Robert Peter Clark, and although the real Bob Clark later stated that he never heard of John List, List just took the name of someone in his former college class. He established a new identity. He enjoyed his life in Denver. It was a fresh start for him in every sense of the word. He was overburdened. He had been a failure. It's always all about him. In every way, he saw his family as a burden, not a source of support. They were all gone, and he was free. He wasn't really haunted by guilt or remorse. Slowly but surely, his past life became a faint memory. As time went on, he thought less and less about his family. He was just thankful to be living a free life, and he didn't want to be incarcerated if it wasn't necessary. By 1985, nearly 15 years later had passed since John List murdered his entire family and became a fugitive. His life had long since returned to normal. He went back to his old career as an accountant. He took an accounting job under the same name, Bob Clark, From 1979 to 1986, he was a controller at a paper box manufacturer outside Denver. He joined a Lutheran congregation and ran a carpool for the church members without transportation. At one religious gathering, he met a Army PX clerk named Dolores Miller, and they were married in 1985. His wife never suspected a thing. John had told Dolores that his wife had died of cancer and that he didn't have any children. His wife refused to believe during the time of his capture that he was John List, that authorities had made a terrible mistake. "I love my husband very deeply," she said about John. After he was arrested, "I do not believe this is the same man." The couple had moved back east to Richmond, Virginia area where the List found another accounting job, was doing the exact same job that he did before he murdered his family. He was a CPA. He was still a volunteer in the Lutheran Church. A guy that kills his own wife and his 3 kids is still volunteering in the Lutheran Church. He was still the same creature that he was when he killed his family. After his capture, John List continued to stand by his alias for several months, even after his 1989 extradition to Union County, New Jersey. Finally faced with irrefutable evidence, including a fingerprint match with List's military records as well as evidence found at the crime scene, he finally confessed his true identity on February 16, 1990. According to trial testimony, Helen had pressured List into marriage by falsely claiming that she was pregnant, then insisted that they marry in Maryland, which did not require premarital syphilis tests mandated in most other states. Though her health progressively deteriorated, she said nothing to List or her physicians until 1969, when a thorough examination revealed her condition. By then, progression of the disease combined with her excessive alcohol consumption had, according to testimony, transformed her into an inept and paranoid recluse who frequently and often publicly humiliated John List, comparing his sexual performance unfavorably with that of her first husband. Appointed psychiatrists tested List suffered from obsessive compulsive personality disorder and that he saw only 2 options, either to go on welfare or to kill every member of his family. Welfare was an unacceptable option, so he chose the annihilation of his entire family. On April 12, 1990, John Emil List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing hearing, he denied direct responsibility for his actions. He said, "I feel that because of my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened." What? "I ask all affected by this for your forgiveness and understanding and prayers." The judge was unpersuaded. The judge stated that John List would be synonymous with the concepts of selfishness, dishonor, and evil. He is a man who could coldly, calculatingly, cunningly conceive and carry out a cowardly plan to assassinate each of his 3 children, his wife, and even his own mother. He is truly a man without a soul. John Emil List is without remorse and without honor. He said, "After 18 years, 5 months, and 22 days, it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. List to rise from the grave." He imposed a sentence of 5 terms of life imprisonment to be served consecutively, maximum permissible penalty at that time. John List filed an appeal of his conviction on the grounds that his judgment had been impaired by post-traumatic stress disorder due to his military service. He also argued that the letter he left behind at the crime scene, essentially his confession, was a confidential communication to his pastor and therefore inadmissible as evidence. A federal appeals court rejected both arguments. John List eventually expressed a degree of remorse for his crimes. "I wish I had never done what I did. I've regretted my actions and prayed for forgiveness ever since." When asked why he had not taken his own life, he said he believed that suicide would have prevented him from going to heaven, where he hoped to be reunited with his family. But murder's okay. John List died of complications from pneumonia at age 82 on March 21st, 2008, and while in prison at the St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. John List annihilated his family out of pride and selfishness. Clearly detached from his family, his only thought was himself. That's why he could sit down and eat a sandwich before killing his children. If it hadn't been for the show America's Most Wanted and forensic sculptor Frank Bender, John List would still be in that accounting office. One final interesting fact about the story of John List is 1 year after he murdered his entire family, the mansion in New Jersey was burned to the ground. I wonder why. May the precious souls of Alma Florence List, Helen Morris Taylor, Patricia List, John List, and Frederick List, all who lost their life on that fateful day in 1971, rest in eternal peace. This is Notorious Minds, and I am M.R. Parks. Please like and share, and by all means subscribe to this channel. Remember to click the notification bell so that you will be notified the next time a future video uploads. Take care of yourselves. Be safe out there. See you next time.